Has it ever happened to you that you were playing a video game and all of a sudden you found yourself back in a spot that you've already gone through somewhere previously in the same game? Maybe it's an area that you've already explored and now you just discovered a new way to get to it. Maybe it's an area that you had to come back to grind some more levels to be able to progress. Or maybe it's an area that the game simply has you retrace through again to continue with the narrative. Well, what you've just experienced is in the industry most often referred to as backtracking. It's a tool that game developers and more specifically often level designers use, in which the player is forced to or made to walk through an area that they've previously been to. But why would you even use this tool at all? And if you decide to use it, how do you make sure it's not implemented poorly and it doesn't cause more annoyance than enjoyment from the player? In this video, we will start by defining what backtracking is, looking at why game designers put it into their games, what happens if you mess the implementation up, and finally, how to do it in a way that it causes maximum enjoyment from the players that are playing the game. Anyways, with that out of the way, bring your compass up, get ready to retrace your steps, and let's go. Now in general, as far as video game tropes go, backtracking is simply most often defined as a situation in which the player is forced or encouraged to navigate back through an area that was previously explored and presumably completed by them. While technically it is often viewed as a neutral video game trope, there are in fact many ways that can push it towards the positive or negative spectrum based on how well it's implemented, which then directly correlates to how enjoyable that section of the game is for the player experiencing it. Just for reference, some of the franchises that are most often referenced in correlation with backtracking would be the Metroid series, the Zelda series, or perhaps the Souls series. But so why would game developers even put it in? I mean, it's obvious that when implemented poorly, it can cause a lot of problems, so why take the risk? Well, the answer to that is multifold actually. First of all, it's a great way to save on content. As a game developer at the start of a project, you most likely establish how long you aim the gameplay of your game to be. It's not really something that you kind of just go along with the flow and let's see what happens. But of course, the longer the intended playtime, the more content you need to be able to fill it up. Unless you reuse some of the content that's already been made. By making a player trek through an area they've already been to, you save a lot on resources, both in animations, in textures, in models, in audio design, and all kinds of other stuff that you've already used once in that area. On the same note, this can also be used as a smart way of doing shortcuts throughout your world, especially if your game is a semi-open world experience or a full open world experience. By using clever shortcuts, you can allow the player to navigate from one area to the next faster and easier by simply tracing back through a little bit of content they've already been through. And if you're doing that, another thing that it helps you with is cohesion, making sure that your whole world feels like one existent space. It doesn't feel like several disconnected levels. This also has a lot to do with immersion. By having the player backtrack through an area they've already been in a way that makes sense logically and geographically compared to where they are in the world, that can help create a much more of an idea of an existing world rather than just a series of hallways or levels that are completely disconnected and have no impact on each other whatsoever. But alright, that's pretty clear. So what happens if you mess it up? Well, if backtracking is implemented poorly, it will most likely result in a much lower enjoyment from the side of the player. You will get a really quick attention drop-off, which will eventually lead into boredom, players not wanting to play through the content, and simply dropping off and letting the game go. It's never fun if you're simply forced to repeat the same thing over and over again with nothing changing. This also touches up a lot on level grinding. If your game has too much of it and the player is forced to spend countless hours doing the same thing over and over again just to be able to progress to another section where they will have to rinse and repeat the same process, it's probably not a very tight gameplay loop, and it might result in the game being not as enjoyable as you think it would be. So how do you do it? What are the steps that you need to follow, or at least attempt to follow, to make sure that backtracking is at least somewhat enjoyable in your game, or perhaps using it for your advantage? We're starting off, make sure to introduce new content. Give the player something new or something exciting to do when they get into that area. The way some of the Metroid games do this is that they will put in content that is inaccessible when you first pass through an area, and only once you've unlocked a few skills later down the line will you be able to backtrace through that place and get to that content. However, this is a very slippery slope, and you should be very careful with implementing these types of features, because if a player is unsure whether they can get to a piece of content or not based on the skills that they have, you run into the risk of them simply passing it along because they think, oh, I just don't have the skills yet to get it, and then never coming back to it because they already had the skills. It was just a bit more of a difficult challenge. With that in mind, and as already mentioned previously, you can use backtracking to establish a world as an existing and real place that the player gets to explore. One game that really masterfully does this is Dark Souls 1, for example, where wherever you are in the world, you always feel like it's interconnected to the other areas, and the more you play, the more you're able to establish this sort of mind map of how the entire place looks in your head. This does a great deal for the player's immersion and for how they experience the gameplay from that point onwards. Next on our list, and something that's surprisingly underused in video games, is using backtracking to your advantage as far as player psychology goes. One game that pretty smartly implements this is, for example, the Stanley Parable, where you backtrack through the first area quite a few times. However, what you might not notice is that a lot of these times, the areas that you actually go through change in very small ways. Maybe there are new cups placed somewhere, maybe the carpet color changes. In some of the more extreme cases, even the hallway lengths might shift. If this is done right and implemented in the proper game genre, for example horror, it can be used to distort the player's psychology to a great level and make them question whether stuff's constantly changing around them, or if it's just something they've noticed recently but has in fact been happening to them all along. And finally, make sure to limit the backtracking to an amount that actually makes sense in the game and that doesn't simply revolve around the player spending way too much time exploring and doing the content that they've already done. A little bit of backtracking can always be fun if incentivized well, but put too much of it in your game and you're very likely to run into the issues that we've previously discussed. So, in conclusion, there are many reasons why you might want to use backtracking in your game, whether that is to save on content, create more immersion, establish atmosphere, or get a more cohesive world. And there are multiple ways to do it and multiple tools that you can use in your arsenal to make sure that the player has a better experience with it than they might otherwise. But make sure to avoid the steps that we discussed that you should avoid, because it will quickly lead to player attention fall off and in general just less enjoyment from your game, which is something you definitely want to avoid. Anyways, that is all I had to say in the topic. I want to thank you all for watching and I hope you enjoyed. If there's anything you think that should be added, something from your own experience, something that you like in games or something that you dislike, make sure to leave it down in the comments. I would love to read it. If you like this type of content, maybe check out some other game design videos I have on my channel. There's quite a few discussing a wide plethora of games out there. If you like the video, maybe consider leaving a like, commenting, or subscribing. All of those would be very much appreciated. I want to wish you all a bit of rest off today, and I'm going to see you in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.